Alright, so the main goal for today is for you guys to get an idea of why the US got involved in World War I. So last week you kind of had a little bit of an overview as to some of the causes of World War I. And so what I'm doing now is we're going to kind of recap or rehash the main reasons for World War I, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the background for America's entry into World War I before you guys get into the Sheg documents. So I want you to have a little bit of an idea of what was going on, the background, the backstory, before you get into reading those. So your job right now as you watch this is to start a new document in your War and Conflict folder. Call it World War I Intro Lecture, and you're going to take notes. What I'm going to keep on the screen for you is just some sample notes. So if you want, you can just copy these notes, you can add to them, you can take your own version of the notes, but I need to see that you have some sort of notes that go along with this. So just to kind of recap what we talked about last week that we didn't get a chance to kind of go through as a class. The causes of World War I had to do with sort of four main things, and we could call those main, so I keep saying main, and then it was sparked by an initial event. So the big pieces that were going on in Europe at this time were militarism, which was building up of armed forces and threatening other nations. So all the main countries, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, Ottoman Empire, to some extent Italy, were all building larger and larger forces, and that was the idea of we're stronger than you are, and we're going to have that large military to show it. It also could mean the military playing a larger role in running the country. The second one was the alliance system. Some of this was public, a lot of it was behind the scenes, but there's basically two major security networks. There's a lot of sort of hidden promises. If so-and-so attacks you, then I'll support you, I'll defend you, and that extends throughout Europe. So essentially you have a situation where two countries declare war, all the rest of them are committed to join in, and with that not being public, other countries didn't know that they were essentially starting a European-wide war when they declared war. So imperialism, there's a lot of conflict over resources around the world. So we look at imperialism as the process or the act of extending control beyond your border. So we know the British Empire had colonies is what we normally assume, think about when we talk about imperialism, but it could be more than that. But Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, a lot of these countries were competing for resources around the world in the form of colonies. So there's a lot of friction about that in countries taking, offense to other countries having possessions around the world. The United States was involved in that, but most of our possessions, things that we were dealing with, were not in Africa or the same part of the world that Europe was dealing with. At this point, we have control of the Philippines, we annex Hawaii. There's some other things going on, but we're pretty far away from that conflict in Europe. The last one, a rise of nationalism that kind of coincides with militarism and people being proud of their country and seeing other countries' actions as a way to interfere with their own country, so other countries are perceived as the bad guys. We also talked about the idea with some of these causes, with militarism and nationalism, that war was considered a good thing. It was something your country needed to go through to prove that it was tough, and it was better to start the war quicker rather than later. So those four big pieces combine into create the conditions for a war to happen. The main event we said that actually started the war was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who would have eventually become the heir to the Ottoman Empire if he's not killed in Serbia by basically a terrorist organization, and that's interpreted as official Serbian policy, which creates this whole big problem, and everybody jumps in with the alliance system. Everybody's willing to fight because of their nationalism and their militarism, and things get out of hand in a quick hurry. But what that doesn't do is that doesn't lead America into the war. So for the first 3 years of the war, we have absolutely nothing to do with this. We are traditionally a very isolated country on purpose. Okay, so that goes all the way back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson warning about getting involved in European affairs. And these are guys that led independence movement. They led the war. They were the founding fathers. They had wrote extensively about staying out of Europe's problems. Washington, in his farewell address after being president, basically says we need to love everyone and stay out of everyone's business. So we want to treat everyone neutral, because if we have permanent alliances with certain countries, that means we're going to get involved in their wars, their conflicts, and that's not going to be good. So we have this history of that. It changed to some extent in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but we didn't want to get involved in something that wasn't our business. So at this time, we have President Woodrow Wilson, and he is big time in support of neutrality. So he doesn't want anything to do with the war. So his whole goal here is to stay out of the war. And he gives some pretty specific reasons for that. He doesn't want to get involved in the war because it wasn't our conflict. We didn't start it. We didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't have a lot of economic ties. This wasn't anything that we had any issues with. So first reason for neutrality is it's not our fight. Why get involved in something that's not our fight? Which is the same reason that we didn't get involved in World War II. The second one was because we had lots of immigrants from Europe. And the logic with this reason is if we started fighting a war, we had to pick one side over the other. That means the people that came from the countries that we aren't supporting would be in conflict with the people that came from the countries that we were supporting. So in other words, people would side with their countries of origins, and then we would have a mess on our hands. So not only would we be fighting a war in Europe, we would be fighting an internal war where we'd have a lot of internal conflict. And again, that was something that Wilson saw as not being worth it. Third reason that Wilson gives is that war is bad for democracy. He doesn't think that war is a good thing, causes people to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And we saw that, some of the other examples we've looked at, but he doesn't believe that war is what a country with elected officials should be doing. They should be solving their problems in a different way. And the last thing that he says is that people die in wars. So kind of that idea of it's not our war, it's not worth it. Our people are going to be killed. They're going to be killing other people. It's going to hurt American families, both physically and psychologically. And he really believes that it's just not worth it. So Wilson, as president, tries to keep us neutral. Some of his readings, his quotes that you're going to look at later, we want to stay neutral in thought and deed and everything else. So we try to stay out of the war. But that doesn't really happen very well because over time we eventually start to support the Allies. So the French, the British, similar allies to what we'll have in World War II. Not exactly the same because the Italians are in there a little bit later. But we start trading guns, selling guns and weapons to both sides, but increasingly that becomes something that we do mostly with the Allies. So over time, Americans increasingly support the Allies. So we don't really stay neutral. Our official policy is neutral, but it doesn't stay that way. So what I want to do is just give you a quick overview of the reasons that we enter into World War I, and you're going to have to evaluate those, and you get a little bit more detail in the reading you're going to do next. So first one is submarine warfare. We didn't think the Germans' use of submarines was a good thing. We thought it was kind of an unfair way that the Germans were cutting off supplies to Britain, which hurt us economically because we were selling stuff to Britain. But we also thought that this was kind of an unfair or underhanded thing to do. So we didn't really like submarine warfare too much. That contributed to our siding with the British, the French. The second main cause was the sinking of the British passenger ship, the Lusitania, who had a couple thousand people on board, and a U-boat sunk that ship in 1915. And basically, the Germans had said, don't get on ships that are carrying weapons. We will blow them up, even if they are passenger ships or whatever. You know, America, if you want to stay out of the war, that's cool. Just keep your people off the boats. And the president, at this point, President Wilson had said, don't go on these boats. The government had warned about, going back and forth during a time of war, but people still did it. The Lusitania had been back and forth between America and Britain several times. Never had any incident, but when it's sunk by a German torpedo, there's 128 Americans that die. And President Wilson says kind of like, look, I told you guys not to get on the boats, but the American public is outraged. So popular opinion by the sinking of the Lusitania is definitely tilted against the British or against the Germans, and it becomes one of those situations where it really is not something that America is okay with, and we start to turn towards the Allies. The other kind of major popular event, if you want to point to an event outside the sinking of the Lusitania, would be the Zimmerman Note, and that was a telegram that the British had intercepted that was going from Germany to Mexico. So the Germans were reaching out to the Mexicans saying, hey, look, if you help us, if America declares war, it's only if America declares war. If America gets in this war and you help us fight against the Americans, we'll make sure that you get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and the other territories that you lost as America expanded. And so we're sort of, this is sort of another publicity thing that turns against the Germans. President Wilson really didn't take this seriously. The Mexicans said, look, we didn't even ask for this. We don't want anything to do. We're not going to war with you. It's okay. Don't worry about it. The Germans are just desperate. But this increases popular outrage against the Germans. So this is one of those things where the Germans become kind of public enemy number one. First, they sink Lusitania. Now they're saying they're going to, conquer our states. Forget them. We should go to war with them. And you combine that with the fact that we had loaned lots of money. So down here where it says economic and munitions makers, we had loaned lots of money to our European allies. We'd basically been trading with both sides, but the vast majority of the money that we were trading was going to Britain. And part of that was because Britain had used their navy to blockade Germany, so we couldn't send supplies to Germany. We could only send them to Britain. But we had loaned lots of money, not just sold things, but we'd also, when they ran out of money, we'd also loan them money, so they owed us money. And a German victory would mean that we might lose that money. So that was going to be a big problem for us if the Germans won. And at this point, the Russians, by 1917, the Russians had surrendered. So the Bolshevik Revolution had happened, and just a little backstory there. During this whole thing, this whole war, the ruler of Russia is overthrown by the Bolsheviks, which we'll know as the communists later. So this is the first time Russia becomes communist, and when that revolution happens, Russia surrenders, essentially allowing Germany to fight against Britain and France and Italy without having to deal with Russia too. This is the same thing that Hitler wanted to happen in World War II but didn't happen. So at this point, the Germans are outnumbering the Allies on the Western Front, which is a concern for us. We're really worried that we might lose all of the money that we had invested with the Allies. And just to give you an idea, we'd loaned $2.2 billion to the Allies, well, only $27 million to the Germans. So it wasn't like it was one-sided. It was, if the Germans win, we lose a whole bunch of money. So that was a contributing factor to the war. And the other thing was that the weapons manufacturers and anybody that would supply war materials, they supported entry in the war because they would profit. They would make a lot of money if we entered the war. So you combine, sort of economic interests with popular outrage from the Lusitania and the Zimmerman note, and you get to a situation where President Wilson is forced to backtrack and enter the war. And what you guys are going to look at with the Sheg stuff is kind of a recap of a couple of his speeches. So a speech saying we're going to stay neutral, a speech saying that we're going to 3 years later saying, okay, nope, we're going to go get into the war, and you're going to compare those. You're going to look at an alternate history from Howard Zinn, which is cynical or against the United States government, saying that the real reasons we entered the war, and you're going to compare that in a textbook excerpt, and then you're going to really have to answer the question, why did we enter the war, and give supporting evidence for that. So make sure you got notes that you're comfortable with for this, because you're going to need to know this stuff. So this is quiz type material that we'll have at the end of this. If you need to go back and retype some things, please do that before you move on to the Sheg stuff.